As the world population grew exponentially in the 20th century, developing nations quickly raced to feed their people. But as food supplies grew scarce, the threat of famine soon arose. Despite the best efforts of scientists and world governments, hunger became an international issue. While many in the 20th century thought the agricultural movement known as the Green Revolution was the answer to world hunger, in actuality it started socioeconomic, political, and environmental crises. Through this revolution, scientists and politicians attempted to take responsibility to fulfill a basic human right. But in India, flawed technology and public policy in fact created a larger cost to the right to food. In 1944, the Rockefeller Foundation started an agricultural research program in Mexico led by Ohio scientist Norman Borlaug. The program set out to develop a revolutionary wheat strain for Mexico and to ensure the right to food in a country where agricultural abundance was scarce. A decade later, the result was a variety of wheat with shorter, thicker stalks which could be grown in multiple growing seasons. With these new varieties, scientists also introduced more intensive fertilizer, pesticide, and irrigation practices. By 1963, 93% of wheat grown in Mexico was Borlaug's new strain, and the overall yields increased 400% after Borlaug's arrival. Seeing Mexico's success, India ordered a shipment of Borlaug's wheat in 1961 along with new rice strains from the Philippines. At the time of this import, India could not offer its grains to an international market as most of it was used to feed its hungry population. Because of this, the Indian government encouraged farmers by offering them credit to purchase these new seeds and fertilizer in order to export more. When planted with the same intensive regime as Mexico, the yield successfully increased across India. The idea of a so-called Green Revolution was planted across the world. But despite the sizable increase in yields, numerous problems arose from these miracle seeds. These high-yielding varieties only achieved full capabilities when grown with fertilizer, pesticides, and intensive irrigation systems, all of which were new to India's organic farming traditions. Over the course of a decade, these new fertilizers began to degrade the land and contaminate nearby water bodies due to water runoff. The available water supply was further depleted through the intensive form of irrigation implemented with these new technologies. This resulted in the abandonment of millions of acres of India's best farmland. Because the planting of wheat and rice crops were so strongly urged by the Indian government, farmers found themselves filling their land with only wheat or rice, an application known as monocropping. The result was a loss of biodiversity, leaving the plants susceptible to disease and soil stripped of essential nutrients.
The same acre of land, using biodiversity, using organic and ecological methods, could produce 5 to 10 times more nutrition than a monoculture can.
Indeed, the Green Revolution offered a short-lived prosperity, but farmers soon began to feel victimized. The Green Revolution led to an overall greater gap between social classes. Because of the costly price of these new technologies, the benefits of increased yields were only achieved by rich farmers with acres of land. Smaller farmers, who often rented land from rich landlords, could not afford the cost to implement these new technologies. Some were entirely left behind, but most bought the technology with loans from unofficial moneylenders. They became trapped in ridiculously high interest rates. Because the demand for land rose with the Green Revolution, landlords forced tenants from their land and often exploited them as laborers in their fields. Soon after the issues arose, the parties involved began to blame one another. The government blamed the farmers for not adhering to the proper fertilizer amounts as prescribed by the fertilizer companies. But ironically, fertilizer companies continually increased the amounts they prescribed for farming use. Farmers claimed the government was responsible as they did not change their agricultural policy despite the harm the Green Revolution was doing to India. As the farmers showed, the crisis was not only caused by faulty technology, but also by the Indian government.
Technology is not the magic wand. Technology has to be supported by right public policies for technology to have an impact.
The government attempted to provide access to fertilizer to all farmers during the 1960s by instituting fertilizer subsidization policies. This enabled farmers to purchase the technology at a cheaper price. Fertilizer plants rapidly sprung up around India, trying to produce enough to supply the growing amount of wheat and rice monocultures. But 3 decades later, subsidization costs soon began to weigh heavily on the Indian government's budget. In 1991, the government cut all the subsidies of fertilizer except for one, a cheap fertilizer known as urea. In the 1990s, uneducated farmers would spread more of the cheap urea in fields already oversaturated with fertilizer. This increase in usage forced the government to import more fertilizer from other countries, which further exhausted the budget. Government policymakers did not take responsibility for this flawed subsidization. Rather, they gradually increased the subsidization of these fertilizers in fear of retaliation from farmers. By doing so, they also secured the electoral votes of rural communities in elections. Nevertheless, the Green Revolution was esteemed as a triumphant success in that it significantly increased wheat and rice yields. Due to these increasing yields, India developed a food buffer stock higher than ever. Yet, at the close of the 20th century, hunger was still rampant. Ironically, hunger persisted mostly in rural areas where crops were grown. Farmers were locked into a government-encouraged market-based system in which all of their food was exported to other regions and countries.
So maximizing the production of commodities for international trade is directly proportionate to the decrease in nutrition availability to local communities, which is why hunger grows.
Because of an inefficient supply chain, the income farmers received for these crops were a mere 1/5 of their sale price. Although the Green Revolution addressed the issue of yield sizes, it did not address the issue of access to food. It did not change the concentrated economic power and even worsened it with the loss of land available to small farmers and the small income returns. As a result, excess wheat rotted with not enough people able to purchase it. After 5 decades of ineffective agricultural practices and equally ineffective public policy, the Indian government finally took responsibility to fix the damage. In 2013, the National Food Security Act introduced a hopeful pathway for those hungry to obtain the food they need. The bill assigned 2/3 of India's population 5 kilograms of food per person per month at a discounted price.
In India, the major food problem is undernutrition. People don't have the money to buy. So to overcome that undernutrition, government introduced the Right to Food Bill, which has made access to food grains a legal right.
While Indian officials continue to work towards solutions that will adequately feed the Indian population, there are implications to this new system. The public distribution system calls for even more cereal crops than the available supply, placing a demand on farmers to plant more. Working to accommodate the need for more food in a growing nation, scientists have also taken responsibility by calling for an agricultural change.
India has a population of 1.5 billion by 2030. We have to produce more and more food from less and less land, less and less water. This is what I call evergreen revolution.
This evergreen revolution would utilize seeds adaptable to the region in which they're planted instead of Borlaug seeds designed for any region. Along with these new seeds, farmers would implement natural fertilizers, reduced irrigation, and a return to a system of biodiversity. With less emphasis on the costly fertilizer and pesticides, farmers would be able to increase their own profit as well as produce more for the nation.
Food production must once again be an issue of sustainability. Taking care of the earth and the human right to food must be an inalienable right.
Despite the advantageous promises of the Green Revolution, it sparked an even larger dilemma in a hungry India. New technology and a faulty public policy proved to create a large cost to the right to food. It devastated a once abundant Indian environment, overlooked traditional modes of agriculture, shattered social structures, and failed to alleviate hunger. Initially, the Indian government refused to accept responsibility, instead blaming the farmers and fertilizer companies. But now, Indian politicians and agronomists have recognized the dilemma. They have taken responsibility by initiating new programs in hope of achieving food security. In the future, new advancements in agricultural technology and public policy should be created around the problematic results of the first Green Revolution, while benefiting both producer and consumer and guaranteeing the right to food to all.